Mark and Jasmine met on a warm spring afternoon, their lives crossing paths in a way that felt destined. Mark, a soldier with a quiet strength, was home on a brief leave, his heart yearning for something deeper than the fleeting moments his military life allowed. Jasmine, a passionate and free-spirited artist, was everything Mark wasn't, full of life, spontaneous, and unafraid of the unknown. They met by chance at a local cafe, their conversation flowing effortlessly. Jasmine was drawn to Mark's sincerity, the depth behind his eyes that hinted at the burden of war he carried. Mark, in turn, was captivated by Jasmine's zest for life, her ability to find beauty in even the smallest moments. It didn't take long for them to fall deeply in love. As their days together dwindled, they made a promise that no matter what, they would hold on to each other. The future seemed uncertain, with Mark's impending deployment looming over them like a storm cloud, but their love was fierce, unwavering. 1 week before Mark was to leave, they decided to marry in a simple ceremony by the lakeside, surrounded by a few close friends. They exchanged vows under the fading sunset, Mark promising to come back to Jasmine, and Jasmine vowing to wait for him, no matter how long it took. But life, as they would soon learn, had other plans. Mark was deployed to a distant and dangerous location, a mission so secret that even Jasmine wasn't allowed to know where he was. The weeks stretched into months, and while they kept in contact through letters and occasional phone calls, the war soon made communication impossible. Mark's letters stopped coming, and the phone remained silent. For the first year, Jasmine clung to hope. She told herself that Mark would be back any day, that she just had to be patient. Every time a knock came at the door, her heart would race, hoping it was Mark walking in with that familiar smile, ready to sweep her into his arms. But each time, it wasn't him. Each time, it was just another day of waiting. As the months turned into a second year, Jasmine began to break under the weight of her uncertainty. The silence between them grew louder, and though she refused to believe Mark was dead, the absence of any news began to eat away at her resolve. She spent sleepless nights staring at the wedding ring on her finger, wondering if she would ever see him again. Her friends urged her to move on, telling her that Mark was likely gone for good, a casualty of the endless war. But Jasmine wasn't ready to let go. Not yet. It was during one of her lowest points that Alex entered her life. Alex was a kind and understanding man who had been a friend of a friend. He wasn't Mark, but he was steady, reliable, and always there when Jasmine needed someone to talk to. He never pressured her to move on, but offered her a shoulder to lean on as she navigated the grief of not knowing. Over time, Alex's patience and kindness started to heal some of the wounds in Jasmine's heart. She still loved Mark, but she couldn't deny the connection she was forming with Alex. After 2 years with no word from Mark and no closure from the military, Jasmine finally allowed herself to believe that Mark might never come back. One evening, after a long conversation about the future, Alex proposed. Jasmine hesitated at first, but the silence from Mark's side had become deafening. She had waited, had given everything she could, but life was passing her by. Slowly, reluctantly, she said yes. Their wedding was a quiet affair, a shadow of the one she had shared with Mark. And yet, for the first time in a long while, Jasmine felt a flicker of happiness. Shortly after, she discovered she was pregnant, and the joy of new life growing inside her helped ease some of the sorrow that still clung to her. She was ready to build a new life with Alex, even if the memory of Mark never truly left her heart. Mark had been through hell and back. His mission had gone awry, and what was supposed to be a year-long deployment had turned into a nightmare of survival. Captured by enemy forces, he spent years in an isolated prison camp, cut off from the outside world. For months, he clung to thoughts of Jasmine, using the memory of her smile to keep himself sane through the worst of the torture. By the time he was rescued and returned to his country, 4 years had passed. 4 long years without a single word from Jasmine, without a single letter sent. His heart ached for her, for the life they had dreamed of building together. He had survived for her. He had fought through pain and despair for her. When Mark finally returned home, the world felt strange and unfamiliar. Everything had changed. Yet his love for Jasmine was the one constant in his life. He imagined her waiting for him, still holding on to the promise they had made so long ago. But as he neared the small town where they once lived, his excitement turned to anxiety. What if she had moved on? What if she had given up on him? The moment Mark saw her, his heart broke. Jasmine stood outside their old house, laughing with a man who held her hand gently, protectively. Her belly was swollen with pregnancy, a life Mark had never been a part of. She had remarried. She had moved on. Mark felt like a ghost, an outsider in the life they were supposed to share. He hadn't prepared for this. He hadn't prepared for the reality that while he had fought to survive, Jasmine had been forced to move on, to live a life without him. He couldn't approach her, not like this. Instead, Mark turned and walked away, his heart heavy with the weight of a love that had been lost to time. Mark stayed away from Jasmine, too overwhelmed by the sight of her with another man, living a life he could no longer be part of. He felt like a stranger in his own world, a man who had fought through years of pain and suffering only to return to a life that no longer existed. His love for Jasmine hadn't diminished, but he knew he couldn't destroy the happiness she had found. The military had declared him MIA, missing in action, for years. His records showed him as presumed dead after no trace of him was found following the failed mission. Jasmine had mourned him, had grieved the man she thought she'd lost forever. She had built a new life, found a new love, and now had a child on the way. How could Mark possibly ask her to give that up? As the days passed, Mark struggled with the reality that everything he had fought for no longer existed. His love for Jasmine had been his lifeline, the one thing that kept him going through endless days of torture and loneliness. But now, it was as if those years meant nothing. He wanted to confront her, to tell her he had come back, that he was still alive. But what good would that do? Jasmine had moved on, and he couldn't expect her to turn her life upside down just because he had returned. The only thing that filled Mark's heart now was a deep, suffocating sense of loss. One evening, Mark finally worked up the courage to visit Jasmine. He stood outside her home, watching her through the window. She looked so peaceful, so content with her new husband and the life they were building together. She seemed happy, and that was something Mark couldn't take away from her. When Jasmine came to the door and saw Mark standing there, her heart nearly stopped. It was as if she were seeing a ghost. Tears welled up in her eyes, a mixture of shock, guilt, and confusion swirling within her. She had loved Mark with all her heart, had waited for him for as long as she could, but she had also come to accept his death, had finally allowed herself to move on. "I thought you were gone," Jasmine whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "I'm not here to ruin your life, Jasmine," Mark said softly, his own voice thick with pain. "I just wanted you to know that I'm alive. But I understand. I see that you've moved on, and I don't blame you for it." Jasmine broke down into sobs, the years of unresolved grief crashing down on her all at once. Mark reached out to comfort her, but it wasn't his place anymore. He knew that now. Jasmine was no longer his to hold. "You have a family now," Mark said, his voice filled with acceptance. "You deserve to be happy." As hard as it was for him to say those words, Mark knew they were true. He couldn't stay in Jasmine's life. He had to let her go. Mark walked away from Jasmine that night, feeling as if a piece of his soul had been left behind. He rented a small apartment in the next town over, trying to rebuild a life that felt foreign and hollow. His time in the military had defined him, and his love for Jasmine had shaped every decision he made. Now, without both, he didn't know who he was. In the weeks that followed, Mark wandered aimlessly. He took on odd jobs, spent time at the gym, and kept to himself. The world had moved on, and so had he, but the emptiness inside him was all-consuming. There were nights when he dreamed of Jasmine, of the life they could have had if things had gone differently. But each time he woke up, he reminded himself that it was no longer his reality. It wasn't until he was invited by a fellow veteran to a local veterans center that Mark began to feel a glimmer of hope. The center was a place where ex-soldiers could gather, share their stories, and support each other. It was here that Mark found a sense of camaraderie that he hadn't realized he was missing. Among these men and women who had also faced the horrors of war, Mark felt a sense of belonging. It was at the Veterans Center that Mark met Sophie, a nurse who had dedicated her life to helping veterans heal. Sophie was kind, patient, and had a quiet strength that reminded Mark of everything he had once admired in Jasmine. She was someone who understood loss, having lost her fiancé in a military operation years before. Their shared experiences created an instant bond between them. Sophie and Mark started spending more time together, first as friends, sharing their stories of heartbreak and survival. Sophie had found her own way to move forward after losing the love of her life, and she gently encouraged Mark to do the same. She didn't push him to forget Jasmine, but rather to accept that life was constantly changing, and love sometimes took unexpected turns. As time went on, Mark found himself opening up to Sophie in ways he hadn't expected. She understood the deep emotional scars that came from war, and she had a way of making him feel seen, understood. They would spend hours talking, sitting in the quiet of the evening, sometimes sharing stories, other times sitting in silence, letting the weight of their pasts wash over them. Sophie had a calming presence that Mark had come to depend on. He didn't feel the rush of passion he had felt with Jasmine, but instead, there was a steady warmth, a quiet companionship that filled the emptiness in his heart. It wasn't the same kind of love, but it was love nonetheless, one that grew from a place of understanding, patience, and mutual respect. Sophie didn't ask for much, and she didn't try to replace Jasmine in Mark's heart. She simply offered him the space to heal, to find himself again, and in that space, something beautiful blossomed between them. Mark began to realize that love didn't have to be a grand, sweeping gesture. Sometimes it was found in the quiet moments of everyday life, in the simple act of being there for each other. Sophie had become his anchor, and over time, Mark found himself falling for her in a way he hadn't expected. Months passed, and Mark finally felt a sense of peace. He still thought of Jasmine, but the pain had faded into something softer, more bittersweet. He would always care for her, always cherish the love they had shared, but he had come to terms with the fact that their time had passed. One evening, as Mark and Sophie walked through the park, he realized just how far he had come. The grief, the loss, the heartache, they were still there, but they no longer defined him. Sophie had shown him that it was possible to move forward, to find joy and love again, even after the darkest of times. As they sat on a bench, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Mark took Sophie's hand in his. She smiled at him, her eyes filled with warmth and understanding. For the first time in years, Mark felt truly content. "This feels right," Mark said softly, looking at Sophie. Sophie smiled, squeezing his hand gently. "It does." And in that moment, Mark knew he had found the love he had been searching for. Not in the past, but here, in the present, with Sophie. It wasn't the love he had once dreamed of, but it was real, and it was his. As the stars began to twinkle in the evening sky, Mark realized that while his journey had been long and painful, it had brought him to a place of healing, a place where he could finally let go of the past and embrace the future. As Mark's relationship with Sophie deepened, there were moments when his past with Jasmine would resurface like a shadow, tugging at the edges of his heart. He tried not to think about her too much, but memories would flood back unexpectedly. A song that played on the radio, a passing glance at a place they once visited, or simply the quiet loneliness of the night. Jasmine had been the love of his life, and even though Sophie brought him peace, there were still unresolved emotions lingering beneath the surface. The few encounters he had with Jasmine since his return had been brief and polite, marked by an unspoken agreement to avoid the topic of their once shared life. But Mark couldn't shake the feeling that something still needed to be said. The weight of those unsaid words hung between them like a distant storm. One evening, Sophie noticed his quietness. They were sitting together at her small kitchen table, the warm light casting a soft glow over the room. She placed her hand on his. "You're thinking about her, aren't you?" Sophie asked gently, her eyes filled with understanding. Mark nodded slowly, his gaze dropping to the floor. He felt a wave of guilt, not because he didn't love Sophie, but because he hadn't fully let go of his past with Jasmine. "You need to see her again, Mark. Not to reopen old wounds, but to close them. I don't want to lose you to something unfinished," Sophie said softly, her voice steady and compassionate. Mark looked at Sophie, amazed at her strength. He knew she was right. He needed closure, not just for his sake, but for theirs. The next day, he decided he would visit Jasmine one last time, not to rekindle what had been lost, but to finally say goodbye to the chapter that had haunted him for so long. Mark arrived at Jasmine's house late one afternoon, his heart pounding in his chest. He wasn't sure how this conversation would go, or if he even had the words to say what needed to be said. As he stood at the door, a mix of emotions washed over him: fear, nostalgia, sadness, but also a strange sense of relief. When Jasmine opened the door, her face showed surprise, but also a quiet understanding. She invited him inside, and they sat in the living room where so many of their old memories had been made. Mark looked around, noticing how much had changed. The home now reflected a different life, one that had moved on without him. "Mark, I wasn't sure I'd see you again," Jasmine said softly, her voice carrying the weight of all that had been left unsaid between them. "I wasn't sure either," Mark admitted, "but I needed to see you, Jasmine. I needed to talk." They sat in silence for a few moments before Mark finally spoke again, his words coming out slowly, as if he were pulling them from deep within his heart. "I loved you, Jasmine. I still do, in a way, but I know our time is past. I spent years clinging to the hope of coming back to you, and when I did, everything had changed. It wasn't your fault. It wasn't anyone's fault, but I have to let you go now." Jasmine's eyes filled with tears as she listened, her own heart breaking all over again, but she knew Mark was right. They had both been caught in a tragic twist of fate, torn apart by circumstances beyond their control. "I waited for you, Mark. For so long, I waited. But when you didn't come back, I thought I'd lost you forever. I had to move on," Jasmine said, her voice cracking with emotion. "I'll always care about you, but we can't live in the past." They sat together for a long time, not speaking, just letting the reality of their situation sink in. There was no bitterness between them, no anger, just a deep, shared sadness for what had been lost and a mutual understanding that they both deserved to find happiness elsewhere. Finally, Mark stood up, his heart feeling lighter than it had in years. He leaned down and kissed Jasmine's forehead, a final farewell to the life they had once shared. "Take care, Jasmine," he said, his voice full of sincerity. "You too, Mark," she whispered. And with that, he left, closing the door behind him and walking away from the past for good. With the final conversation with Jasmine behind him, Mark returned to Sophie, his heart now free from the burdens of his past. He had thought closure would be painful, but instead, it had brought him peace. For the first time in years, he felt like he could truly move forward, without the weight of regret, without the shadow of what could have been looming over him. Sophie was waiting for him when he got home, sitting on the porch swing in her small garden. She smiled when she saw him, her eyes full of warmth and quiet anticipation. "How did it go?" she asked, her voice soft but knowing. "It went well," Mark said, sitting beside her. He took her hand in his, feeling the steady rhythm of her pulse beneath his fingers. "It's over now. The past is finally behind me." Sophie leaned her head on his shoulder, and they sat together in comfortable silence, watching the sunset. It was a simple moment, but for Mark, it held more meaning than he could express. He had found something with Sophie that he hadn't realized he needed: peace, stability, a love that wasn't built on fiery passion, but on mutual understanding and shared strength. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Mark turned to Sophie, his heart full of gratitude and love. "I'm ready now," he said quietly. "For what?" Sophie asked, tilting her head to look at him. "For us. For everything." Sophie smiled, and in that moment, Mark knew that he had found his home, not in a place, but in a person. Sophie had been his rock, the one who had quietly stood by him while he found his way back to himself. And now, he was ready to build a future with her, one filled with hope, healing, and love. Over the next year, Mark and Sophie's relationship grew stronger. They bought a small house together just outside of town, where they could live quietly, away from the chaos of the city. Mark continued to volunteer at the Veterans Center, finding purpose in helping others who had been through similar experiences. Sophie worked as a nurse at the local clinic, her calming presence a balm for all who needed her. They didn't rush into anything. Mark and Sophie took their time, building a life together slowly, intentionally. They enjoyed the simple things: long walks in the woods, cooking meals together, and spending quiet evenings by the fire. Mark had found peace, not just with his past, but with his future. He realized that love didn't always look like the grand, sweeping romance he had once imagined. Sometimes it was found in the steady rhythm of everyday life, in the comfort of someone who understood you in ways no one else could. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the stars, Mark turned to Sophie, a smile playing on his lips. "Let's make this official," he said, his voice full of quiet determination. Sophie looked at him, her eyes twinkling with amusement. "Are you asking me to marry you, Mark?" "I am," Mark said, taking her hand in his. "I'm ready to start the next chapter of our lives, Sophie, together." Sophie's smile widened, and she nodded. "I'd love nothing more." And with that, Mark finally closed the chapter on his old life and stepped into a future full of hope and love with Sophie. Thank you for watching. Hope you enjoyed the story. Please don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe for more delightful stories.